Hello everyone, I want to welcome you to week 8 of Bioethics 400, Responsible Conduct of Research. As always, just to remind you, we focus in this course on the 8 areas of research integrity as defined by the U.S. Office of Research Integrity, or ORI. And this week we're going to be focusing on issues of publication and responsibility of authorship. This is actually an area of research that is near and dear to the hearts of many students, particularly graduate students, but also undergraduates like yourself. Those of you who have already been listed as authors of a publication are likely to be quite proud of this achievement, and you may even feel that it sort of vindicates you as a young scientist. Now, most of you probably have yet to be recognized as authors in a scientific manuscript, but are likely to be anxious for your first publications because, again, these validate you as a researcher, but also provide opportunities that come with the achievement and the responsibilities of scientific authorship. So what we need to do is we need to really explore issues of authorship and publication ethics. The learning objectives for this week and this module are to understand the importance of authorship in the scientific process and to review the criteria for authorship, as well as appreciate some of the ethical problems that can arise. And I want to start by talking a little bit about publication ethics. Now, there are a number of professional organizations like the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, and they define publication ethics as, quote, the set of ethical principles and the rules derived from them that describe the proper behavior of authors, editors, reviewers, publishers, and academic and research institutions according to today's standards. So, publication isn't just about the researchers themselves, but actually is about the entire scientific publishing endeavor. And it is an important aspect of research communication, both to the scientific community as well as to the general public. And so it's beginning to attract a growing interest. Many professional organizations have ethics regulations on publication, and editors and publishers organizations such as COPE as well as others have been specifically established to address ethical issues that emerge during the scientific publication process. Right. Now, so why is publication so important? Well, as research has become more complex and multidisciplinary, and the need for many different types of experts to perform studies has increased, investigators today, as you've learned in the previous weeks about collaboration, are really beginning to work together on projects with colleagues from across the country and around the world. They're working with senior scientists, clinicians, undergraduate and graduate students like yourselves, technicians, postdoctoral fellows, medical students and residents, statisticians, and other research professionals. And each of these individuals brings a different expectation and even a different cultural experience to such issues as who should be included in a paper for publication and for what purpose. For example, a graduate student and an advisor may have very different ideas about authorship, and different disciplines may have fewer or more authors on a paper. So authorship matters. Now, all of this dates back actually many centuries to the printing press and sort of the Renaissance. The relevance of publication in science was really demonstrated historically by the effects of the printing press. As information could become more easily disseminated, and the Industrial Revolution that followed, it allowed scientists to communicate and students to learn more about standardized and current information. And with the ability for scientists to share ideas and findings, research proliferated. Now today, there is an abundance of data, published and unpublished. When a study is published, unpublished data may still be requested and statistical analyses may be replicated in order to ensure that accurate results have been stated. Additionally, sharing data, as you've learned, allows several investigators to make use of the information, utilizing it in different ways to advance science for the ends of societal benefit as well as commercial opportunities. Now, that means that published research has to be held to a high standard. Publication is a filter that allows for relevant and quality research reports to be published for the scientific community to utilize. And although this filter is helpful, it does not guarantee that what is published is actually quality work. As we'll learn in a couple weeks' time, fabrication and falsification can slip through, and some researchers may butter up less than impressive results. Science's standards of information and particularly upholding those standards of information becomes increasingly important as scientific publications are the most reliably objective information that most people have. This is what gives science its credibility and its utility, with the potential benefits for society and the environment limited by the objective purity of the research. In addition to objectivity, standards of publication must be high for honesty, description, and citation. So authorship really does matter, and it matters not only for society but for individuals themselves. Peer-reviewed published literature in the sciences as well as in the arts is an essential foundation upon which knowledge builds in our society. The publication of articles allows for validation and discussion of new ideas, and articles also provide credit for professional advancement as scientists seek grants and promotions. Being held accountable for the content of an article seems to be a minimal responsibility for an author whose name is on the paper. In addition, you have to maintain objectivity and acknowledge potential biases when called upon as an expert to review a grant proposal or a submitted article before publication. This also seems to be a reasonable standard, and we'll be talking about the expectations about peer review next week. Now, this is where issues around things like fidelity begin to matter. So fidelity requires that a paper be objective, honest, an accurate description of the topic, and adequately cited and supported. In many ways, fidelity is the top virtue of a true scientist. Now, when we talk about objectivity, objectivity is ideally reporting and describing observations without interjection of opinions or biases. This is what gives science its credibility and its utility. Publications also have to be honest. Now, this is similar to objectivity. It is expected that reported data is the actual data that was obtained. Honesty is inherent in any standard of research reporting. You also have to have an accurate description. Everyone is likely familiar with partial truth or even false news. Fake news. Sometimes simplification or selective reporting of a particular research project can impress to one's benefit or lighten one's workload. But the description should be accurate in detail to convey information with reasonable accuracy. Finally, you also have to have proper citation and literature review. As we'll discuss in coming weeks, plagiarism occurs when another author of information being used is not cited, but this is not the only problem with fidelity and citation. One can also perform self-plagiarism if one does not properly cite when referencing one's own work published elsewhere. And additionally, there is what is called citation amnesia. This is when important works in a given field are not given reference in a publication. These pivotal works deserve recognition for the information and idea's origin, and referencing these works evidences a more thorough literature review and more quality scholarship. Now, a lot of people are tempted to be selective in their citations, if only to select citations that predominantly support their hypotheses rather than those that refute that. But the quality of a pure scientist, someone that shows fidelity in publication, is someone that is willing to admit and even cite the publications and the authors that disagree with their theories or their conclusions. And so it's important for any publication to have an accurate representation of the state of the literature as it currently stands. So, what do we know about established international guidelines? Well, as I've already mentioned, there are a number of general organizations, such as the Committee on Publication Ethics, or COPE, that have the aim of providing a forum for editors of academic journals to discuss issues relating to the integrity of works submitted to or published in the journals. And this includes establishing international guidelines for publication ethics. There are also more specific organizations that deal with publication ethics directly, such as the World Association of Medical Editors, WAME, and the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, ICMJE. These organizations were established to work on a more universal policy of publication in the biomedical sciences. Each of the main documents and policies or guidelines of these organizations is focused on publication ethics. Finally, Cycle conferences about peer review and publication in biomedical journals are frequently organized by groups such as the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, and the British Medical Journal Group, BMJ Group. For example, they recently hosted the International Congress on Peer Review and Biomedical Publication. General international guidelines devoted to biomedical research sometimes also focus on the issue of publication and responsibility. For example, the WAMA, World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki, an important human subjects research document that we will explore in weeks 13 and 14 of this course, Article 30 of that document states that, quote, authors, editors, and publishers all have ethical obligations with regard to the publication of the results of research. Authors have a duty to make widely available the results of their research on human subjects and are accountable for the completeness and accuracy of their reports. They should thus adhere to accepted guidelines for ethical reporting. Negative and inconclusive as well as positive results should be published or otherwise be made publicly available. Sources of funding, institutional affiliations, and conflicts of interest should also be declared in the publication. Reports of research not in accordance with the principles of this declaration should not be accepted for publication. So what you see is the establishment of clear international guidelines around expectations of scientific publication. And this includes not only publishing positive results of research, but also negative or flat findings of research so that people don't waste their time replicating experiments or pursuing avenues of research that might not be fruitful. Now, for the biomedical sciences, we have what's known as the Vancouver rules. They're so named because they came out of the results of a conference that was held in Vancouver, Canada. And that came up with a list of authorship criteria, which states that authorship credit is based only on a substantial contribution to a paper, and that has to include conception and design or data analysis and interpretation, has to include drafting the article or revising it critically for important intellectual content, and final approval of the version to be published, right? So what this means is that all authors included in a paper must fulfill these criteria, and no one that fulfills the criteria should be excluded as an author. Okay? Rather, if someone doesn't meet these three criteria, all three criteria for authorship, they should be largely given an acknowledgement. Okay? And acknowledgements are a special section in most publications that acknowledge input and advice and other support that was provided by people that were involved in the research project but do not meet the three criteria for being an author on a paper. Now, those individuals who are acknowledged must, like authors, give written permission to be acknowledged, and their financial and material support should also be acknowledged in the manuscript. So what this leads to questions around who's an author and who's not an author. And so there's 4 different types of undeserved authorship. And those 4 types are gift authorship, honorary authorship, prestige authorship, and ghost authorship. Now, different institutions often have different practices about who should be included on a paper. At some institutions, it is common for heads of department to be listed as authors, as so-called guest authors or gift authors, although they did not directly contribute to the research. At other institutions, laboratory heads would routinely be included as authors technicians who may have performed many experiments, but may not have made a significant intellectual contribution to a paper. Others might give a technician like that only an acknowledgement at the end of paper. Now, some academic supervisors may have their graduate students collect data, do research, and write up the results, yet not give them credit on a paper, while others may give full authorship credit to students. And this falls under the expectations of sort of this mentor-trainee relationship that we talked about last week. Finally, some foreigners in the United States may feel obligated to put mentors from their home countries on a paper, even though they did not participate in the research. Now, another accountability problem in authorship occurs when investigators hire a ghost author. Okay, this is work that's done by my colleagues Mildred Cho and Martha McKee at Stanford University's Biomedical Center. And what they found in some of their studies is that pharmaceutical companies often hire ghostwriters for clinical studies and then have others sign their names as authors. Busy investigators may also employ medical writers to write up studies. But the problem with a ghost author is that he or she may not fully understand the underlying experiments and may not be able to explain the content of the work to other scientists, co-authors, or editors at the journal, right? So this gets to these questions of an article being, meeting the standards of fidelity. Now, writing is a process that often helps an author clarify what he or she is thinking, and so a ghost author, when used, may dilute what is relevant, leading to possible mistakes. Finally, ghost authors take away the opportunity to train students and postdoctoral fellows, as well as some junior faculty, to be authors themselves. Finally, though not listed here, is the question of sponsorship. For example, should a private company who is sponsoring a study have control over if and when it is published? We talked a little bit about this during our module when we were talking about academic industrial collaborations, but consider, for example, the case of Nancy Ovalery at the University of Toronto. So Dr. Ovalery was testing a new drug for people with thalassemia, a disease that is characterized by the inability of a person to make one of the two proteins of hemoglobin, the blood's oxygen carrier. If not treated, the disease is usually fatal in childhood. Now, the drug that she was testing in oral formulation was meant to be an alternative to an injectable drug already in use that treats the iron buildup that occurring in people with thalassemia when they frequently get transfusions for their condition. Now, although the drug showed promise in the early 1990s, Dr. Oliveri, as part of her studies, has evidence in 1996 that patients taking the drug had a dangerously high iron concentration. She said that she reported the negative findings, and in fact the dangerous findings, to the sponsoring company, which soon afterward withdrew funding from her trial and told her to stop speaking about or publishing her results. Although she had signed a non-disclosure agreement, Dr. Oliveri felt obligated to report her findings since they would affect the health of patients. And in fact, in 1998, she published her results in the New England Journal of Medicine. Now, her actions led to problems with the sponsoring company, as you might imagine. That company threatened her with legal action and also threatened the University of Toronto. The University of Toronto subsequently fired her as a result of the controversial study. Although she was ultimately rehired, the disputes between the university and the hospital where she worked took over 4 years to resolve. It wasn't until November 2002 when they signed a confidential settlement agreement between the University of Toronto and the hospital, as well as with Dr. Oliveri. So what this comes up to is the idea, something that we touched upon in our week where we focused on industrial collaborations with industry, is really that authors should not agree to give a study sponsor the right of first approval of an article before publication. So what I want to do is I want to focus on authorship using a case study with you guys. So let's consider the following study looking at the influence of blood type on the frequency of mosquito bites, and consider which of these individuals should be an author according to the Vancouver rules. Now remember, those rules state that an author is someone that had a substantial contribution to the conception and design or acquisition of data or analysis and interpretation of the data, and a substantial contribution in drafting the article or revising it critically for important intellectual content, and final approval of the paper. All three of those conditions must be met in order for someone to qualify as an author. So let's look at, on the next 2 slides, we're going to consider who should be an author out of the following 7 people. The first person is Dr. Alice Held It Together. She's a senior lecturer in the department. She ran the study, helped collect the data, sent the data to the statistician for analysis, arranged for the write-up of the study by an editorial consultant, and negotiated with the editors. So does she meet the standards for authorship under the Vancouver criteria? Well, obviously, right? because she was directly involved in the conceptual design of the study or the acquisition of data. Right? She was also indirectly involved in the analysis and interpretation of the data by sending the data to the statistician. She did have a substantial contribution in drafting the article or revising critically for important intellectual content, since she arranged for the writing up of the study by the consultant. She also negotiated with the editors for its publication, which suggests that she had final approval of the paper. So clearly she's an author. Now, what about Professor John Fullivant? He's the department chair. Now, he raised money to provide salary support for the professors in the department and got permission from the REC, or Research Ethics Committee, that's similar to an IRB in this country. So he got permission from the ethics committee that approves human research to conduct the study. Does he meet the standards for authorship? Now, in many countries, it would be expected that a department chair like Professor Fullivant would be included as an author on the paper, particularly since he raises the money that provides salary supports for people like Dr. Held It Together. Unfortunately, he does not meet all three criteria of the Vancouver rules, since he did not have a substantial contribution to the conception and design or acquisition of the data, although getting permission from the IRB might be seen as contributing to that. He did not have a substantial contribution in drafting the article or revising it critically for important intellectual content, at least from what this says. Now, it is possible that he did give some comments back to Dr. Held It Together, but that is not suggested here. And then, does he have final approval of the paper? Well, again, it's not suggested here. So he probably would not qualify as an author. Now we have Dr. Alex Longon. He's a senior lecturer in the department. He drew up the protocol, wrote the grant proposal to get funding for the study, but he actually died before the study began. Right? So under the Vancouver rules, he does have a substantial contribution to the conception and design of the study, since he drew up the protocol, but he didn't help in drafting the article or revising it critically for important intellectual contribution, nor did he have final approval of the paper, because obviously he died before that could occur. Now, it's unfortunate, but he does not qualify to be an author under the expectations of the Vancouver rules. Most likely, he would be deserving of an acknowledgement. Got 4 others to consider. Professor Mike Haftush, he's a professor in the department. He suggested the idea for the study, but then departed on a 6-month sabbatical to Dubrovnik. He also handled all post-publication media inquiries. Now, does he have a substantial contribution to conception or design of the study? Possibly. I mean, he suggested the idea for the study, but how much was he actually involved in the design of the work, the acquisition of the data, or the analysis or interpretation of the data? Probably not a lot. Did he have a substantial contribution in drafting or revising the article? Doesn't seem to be. It seems like his only interaction was post-publication media inquiries. So he does not meet the last 2 criteria of the Vancouver rules. We have Dr. Polly Probability. She was the statistician working with Dr. Held It Together. She ran all of the data analyses and prepared the tables for the study. Now, it might not seem like she deserves authorship, but actually she probably does. Under the Vancouver rules, she did have a substantial contribution to the analysis and interpretation of the data, and if she prepared the tables, those tables were probably used in the manuscript themselves, so she clearly had a substantial contribution in the drafting of the article and revising it critically for important intellectual content. She also probably contributed directly to the manuscript by providing a description of the statistical methods used. Now, we don't know anything about her final approval of the paper, but my guess is that she does meet the standards for authorship. Now, Pamela Poltergeist was the editorial consultant that Dr. Held It Together hired to write the paper, but she was not involved in the conception and design or acquisition of the data, nor in the analysis or interpretation of the data, so she probably only deserves an acknowledgement and not authorship. Finally, and this is a tricky one because we have Mr. Thomas Techie. He's a clinical laboratory assistant. He ran all of the laboratory tests on the collected samples. We don't have enough information in this case. Now, I remember how a couple minutes ago I talked about how different labs have different sort of standards for including technicians, laboratory technicians, as authors on articles. And in fact, I've often had this struggle back when I had my lab at the New York State Department of Health in determining if and when a technician in my laboratory deserved to be an author on a paper that we published. Now, in this case, we know that he ran all of the laboratory tests on the collected samples. Now, does that meet the standards of substantial contribution to conception and design or acquisition of data and analysis or interpretation of data? Well, he definitely acquired the data, right? Now, he may have had some sort of substantial contribution to the conception and design by proposing or even developing the methods used. And he may also have helped in the interpretation of the data, particularly since Dr. Probability and Dr. Held It Together probably aren't familiar with the most modern technologies or approaches to collecting and analyzing the data necessary for a project like this. Now, did he have a substantial contribution in drafting the article or revising it critically? And that we don't know. He might have actually contributed to the materials and methods section. That's possible. So we really need more information before we can make a determination of whether or not Mr. Techie actually meets the standards for authorship under the Vancouver rules. So what you can see, obviously, is that really determining authorship can be tricky. So when you are getting involved in a research study that is likely to lead to a publication, there really needs to be discussion of authorship and even authorship order optimally at the inception of a research project, and it should involve a purposeful and thoughtful examination of the expected contributions of all individuals who are involved. Okay? So again, all contributors who do not meet the criteria for authorship should be listed in the acknowledgement section. And this includes people who provide purely technical help, provided writing assistance like Ms. Poltergeist, or who were a department chairperson who only provided general support. Editors often also ask corresponding authors to declare whether or not they had assistance with study design, data collection, data analysis, or manuscript preparation. And if such assistance was available and provided, authors really should disclose the identity of the individuals who provided that assistance and any entity that supported it in the published article. These financial and material support concerns really do matter. Okay? That's because of this issue around competing interests. An author has a competing interest when she has an attribute that is invisible to the reader or editor, but they may affect her judgment. So this is this issue around conflicts of interest, conflicts of commitment. They really have to be indicated in a manuscript. For example, if you have a manuscript that is comparing a drug that is manufactured by GlaxoSmithKline with a drug that is manufactured by Pfizer, and the research suggests that the drug manufactured by GlaxoSmithKline works better, well, it will matter to the consideration of the validity of that data and the fidelity of the research if the investigator who headed up that study acknowledges or has any financial support and contributions by GlaxoSmithKline. If I saw a study that reported to find that Glaxo's drug worked better, but it was clearly funded and supported by Glaxo, I would probably take it with a grain of salt. On the other hand, if I saw a study that was funded by GlaxoSmithKline, but that showed that Pfizer's drug worked better, then I'd probably accept that data with little or no consideration. Now, a lot of researchers, it is well known, fail to repeat such conflicts of interest or conflicts of commitment because doing so implies wickedness, and they are not confident that their judgment was not affected by these potential conflicts. But for the most part, conflicts of interest, competing interests, etc., all need to be declared in the article itself. This includes all interests that are of financial nature, but also those that are intellectual, professional, personal, or political nature because of their potential influence on the behavior and the content, as well as from perception that such potential influences could undermine the objectivity, integrity, or perceived value of a publication. Okay? And it's actually quite interesting because company-sponsored studies are significantly more likely, in fact 3 times more likely, to paint a rosy picture of a drug or a device than independent trials do. And this is the result of a comprehensive review by the Cochrane database of systemic reviews. Now, we've talked a lot about the guidelines, particularly the Vancouver rules, as well as the guidelines from organizations like WAMI, as well as the International Council of Medical Journal Editors. Now, 2 major problems with these guidelines are that many members of the scientific investigation are unaware of them, and many scientists do not subscribe to them. In fact, according to my friends Mildred Cho and Martha McKee at Stanford University, when they looked at this issue, they found that 21% of the authors of basic science papers and 30% of the authors of clinical studies actually had no involvement with the conception or design of a project, the design of the study, or the analysis and interpretation of data. So actual practice, in at least a third of cases, seems to be at odds with the Vancouver rules and recommendations of professional organizations for scientific publication like COPE and the ICMJE. Now, I want to talk about some problems that arise in publication. The first of these is the idea of duplicate submission and publication. This refers to the practice of submitting the same study to 2 journals or publishing more or less the same study in 2 different journals. And these duplicate submissions or publications can be nearly simultaneous or can occur years apart. Okay? Now, studies have found that about 1/5 of all papers and studies and data that are published in the scientific literature have been published in more than 1 journal. But this does pose a serious problem. Now, why is that? Well, one is that we already know that positive studies are much more likely than negative studies to be published. And in fact, positive studies are even more likely than negative studies to be published twice. What this does is it distorts levels of evidence in the literature. Right? Scientific literature, scientific theories, hypotheses, laws are all dependent on how often they appear and how often that they are validated publicly. And so the more a scientific finding seems to confirm a hypothesis, the more likely it will become accepted as a theory or even a scientific law by the larger community. If one study was done but it is published twice in the scientific literature, in 2 completely different formats, in 2 completely different journals, this will give double weight to that evidence in terms of convincing the larger scientific community whether or not this particular hypothesis is valid. And so it will actually skew the results in favor of that hypothesis when in fact the data don't necessarily support that particular theory. There's also the problem of space in peer-reviewed journals. If an article is published twice, then it actually, that second time, it will take space that could be devoted instead to another researcher's finding on the same topic or a different topic. So really, not only does it distort the levels of evidence in a positive way for a particular hypothesis, it also prevents others from sharing information about other studies that are equally as important. It also wastes editors, reviewers, and readers' time. And then finally, it infringes legally on publishers' copyrights. So redundant publication is often a problem. Now, there are some situations in which redundant publication is allowable. Redundant publication is allowable in certain circumstances when those publications are really meant to be, repetition of guidelines, translations of articles from English into another language or vice versa, or commemorative articles. Now, when I was the executive editor of the American Journal of Bioethics, for example, we actually published a seminal article on medical ethics written by the famed bioethicist Ed Pellegrino in order to recognize the 75th anniversary of his birth. And then we invited researchers to comment on that article, which had been published 25 years prior, and talk about its relevance to modern-day clinical practice. Now, that was allowable because we met certain conditions for acceptable redundancy. We've got prior approval from the Journal of Medical Ethics in which this article had previously been published, and we also recognize the priority of that original publication. We specifically cited it in the cover and the introduction to the commemorative article, and we made sure to recognize that this was an article published 25 years ago in another journal. We also made sure that this publication was really meant for a different audience. Now, it wasn't meant for a different audience in terms of the field, but it was meant for a different audience in terms of the time, right? 25 years later, when you had an entirely new group of ethicists as well as physicians who were in the field and may not be familiar with the work of Dr. Pellegrino from 25 years ago. Finally, we made sure that it faithfully reflected the data interpretations of the primary version, and in fact, it was the primary version word for word, and we again stated the primary reference. So in that case, redundant publication was allowable because it wasn't meant to distort the literature or take away space from other findings, but was instead really meant to advance our discussion and made it clear that this was a redundant publication. Now, I want to talk finally about one other form of redundant publication, and this is known as least publishable units, or LPUs, and sometimes it's referred to as salami science. Now, this refers to situations in which one single study is split into several parts and submitted to 2 and more journals, or findings that have been previously published elsewhere are again repeated in another journal without proper cross-referencing, permission, or justification. Right? So, why do you think that this might be a problem? Well, again, it's for some of the same reasons that redundant publication is a problem. It can distort the levels of evidence, it wastes readers' and reviewers' time, it wastes editors' time, and it takes away valuable space in other peer-reviewed journals. Unfortunately, salami science has become common practice because, as you remember from the very beginning of this lecture, publication, and in fact the frequency, the number of publications, is an important metric for a researcher's productivity and is the basis for things like promotion, tenure, and receiving of grants. So there is a lot of salami science out there that ends up in the published literature, and unfortunately, sometimes it's very hard to distinguish salami science and LPUs from really good quality works. The only way you know it is if you're familiar with the authors and you're familiar with their work. So that's just examples of some of all of the problems with that occur in publishing. So some of the issues obviously are undeserved authorship or overlooked authorship. You also have the problem sometimes of conflicts between collaborators about authorship because your position in the author list is a measure of your credit. You have problems of redundant publications, least publishable units, problems of plagiarism and self-plagiarism. So all of these things are really issues that arise and are things to consider as you begin to establish yourselves as working professionals in research, and as you guys begin to strive to publish your findings in the peer-reviewed literature. Now, I'm going to end there for this week's module, but I do want to remind you that we will be discussing publication further next week when we explore issues around peer review and the peer review process, why it's important, and what some of the obligations of peer reviewers are to both the authors of the manuscripts they're reading, as well as to the editors of journals and to general readership. And then also we'll be exploring some publication ethics issues a little bit more in 2 weeks' time when we talk about scientific misconduct, particularly when we talk about issues of fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, and particularly when these misconduct gets into the peer-reviewed and published literature. So with that, I'm going to end, and I will see you guys all online in the discussion forums. Goodbye.